But there has been complete opposite procedure controlling deaths using nature. It's understandable for victim of viral disease think bringing on his death. After all, when continued life will only bring you suffering. What's the point of living? This logic has been resisted by the court system, and results indicate that the right day rapidly becoming issue. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be the direction and cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia characteristic of the subject that no longer has present purpose or intention of God. Uh, More recently, however, there has been completely opposite approach to controlling death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of viral disease of simply bringing on his own death. After all, when continuing life will only bring further suffering, what's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that right to die is actually becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, a Washington state law banning doctors and suicide was struck down. The reason being the claim that a suicide violates the constitutional right of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's supervision. The intention of such a law is justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite his defense, euthanasia is understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia characteristic of society that no longer has present purpose the intention of God. What's the point of living? This logic has entered recently a federal court system, and the result indicates the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by the religious community. For example, the Washington state law banning doctors' assisted suicide struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional right of terminal ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite these facts, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to be the society no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. However, there has been completely opposite approach in considering death euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of a fatal disease thinking bring of his own death. After all, by continuing life will only bring greater suffering. What's the point of living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by the judicial community. For example, a Washington state law banning doctors' suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional right to terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be a rational act intended to cause the patient. It seems to me that euthanasia characteristic characteristic characteristic. More recently, however, there has been completely opposite approach to control death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of fatal disease to think of bringing on his own death. After all, a continuing life will only bring suffering, not the point in living. This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the result indicates that the right to die is rapidly evolving an issue and must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, in Washington state law banning doctors assisted suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional right to terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves without doctor prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this defense, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia characteristic of a society that no longer has faith in purpose and intention of God. More recently, however, there has been conflicting observations. Victim of fatal Tuesday to think of bringing on his own death. After all, when continuing life, you are only bringing greater suffering. What's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in federal court system, and results indicate that right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly. For example, a Washington state law banning doctors suicide was struck down. The reason being prohibiting suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves without doctor prescription. The intention of such a law being justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite these terms, evidence has been understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia characteristic of society that no longer has faith in purpose or intention of God. More recently, however, there has been complete observed prosecution to death euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of fatal disease to some for victim to think of bringing on his own death. Think of bringing on his own death. After all, when continuing life will only bring greater suffering, what's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the result indicates the right to die is a reason to the federal court system. The result indicates the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious community. For example, a Washington state law banning doctor-assisted suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting other suicide violates the constitutional right of terminal illness, medical complication who want to kill themselves without a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting suffering. The intention of such a law justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Children who want to kill themselves without doctor prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia understood to be a restriction act patients. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of society longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. Satisfaction. The reason being the prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional right of family heir, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor prescription. The intention of such law has been satisfied, getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of society no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. Is suicide struck down. The reason being prohibited assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminal ill, mental contemplation. We want to kill themselves with doctor prescription. The intention of such a role has been justified as of getting rid of suffering. We want to kill themselves, doctor's prescription. The intention of such a role has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this defense, euthanasia, euthanasia, euthanasia is often considered for the doctor's prescription. The intention of such a role is justified getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an injectional act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of the society that intend to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that it seems to me it seems it seems to me it seems to me it, it, se- it seems to me that may cause the death of patient. It seems to me that at the euthanasia is characteristic of society. Euthanasia is often understood longer have faith in the purpose or the intention of God. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of society and no longer has faith in purpose and intention of God. More recently, however, there has been more recently, however, there has been a completely opposite approach to controlling death. More recently, however, there has been a completely opposite approach to controlling death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of a fatal disease to think of planning on his own death. After all, when continuing life will only bring greater が聞こえない. After all, when continuing life, bring greater つってんの。なんだって？After all, when continuing life will only bring greater suffering. つってるはずだ。After all, when continuing life bring greater suffering. What's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. Religious, religious, religious communities. Suicide struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assist suicide violates the Constitution based on climate fear and anti-contemplation. I want to keep them here with the prescription. The intention to such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patient. It seemed to me that using shared characters of society that no longer have faith in the purpose and intention of God. Mm. However, there has been a better observed approach to controlling death, euthanasia. It is understandable victim of every desire to simply bring more his own death. After all, we continue life will only bring greater suffering. What's the point in living? This strategy has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, a Washington state law banning doctors to suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be a rational act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that euthanasia is a characteristic of society that no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. 熱い。As constitutional rights of 10 years, mentally committed patients who want to kill themselves with prostitution. Intention such with way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that the euthanasia is a characteristic of a society that no longer finds faith in purpose and intention of God. Unactionable or 政策的検証、検討された。フェラルコート連邦裁判。フェラルコートシステム would indicate like shock down, 却下する。ストライクダウン、却下する。却下する。ポピュレート。constitution, 憲法書 constitution, constitutional, 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 constitution, 憲法。ターミナル末期の病。mentally competent, competent, 精神上有能な問題がない。精神的能力を持っている。精神的能力がある。プレスクリプション、処方。get more recently, however, there has been a complete outside approach to control death, euthanasia. It is understandable victim of failure desire to simply bring on his own death. After all, when continuing life will only bring little suffering, what's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, in Washington state law banning doctors assisted suicide is struck down, the reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of society that no longer has faith in the purpose or intention of God. Hmm. More recently, however, there has been a completely opposite approach to countering death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of a fatal disease to think of bringing on his own death. After all, when continuing life will only bring greater suffering. What's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must address directly religious communities. For example, in Washington state law banning doctor-assisted suicide is struck down, the reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been satisfied as alleviating greater suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be a restrictional act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of society that no longer fights in the purpose and intention of God. More recently, however, there has been a completely opposite approach to countering death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of a fatal disease to think of bringing on his own death. After all, one continued life will only bring greater suffering. What's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that the right to die after becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, in Washington state law banning doctor suicide was struck down, the reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional right of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an exceptional act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that the euthanasia is characteristic of society that no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. Objectionable object. Kind of.
暑いの
More recently, however, there has been a completely opposite approach to countering death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of a fatal disease to think of bringing on his own death. After all, one's continued life will only bring greater suffering. What's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in federal court systems, and results indicate that the right to die rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, a Washington state law banning drug-assisted suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates a constitutional right to terminally ill, mentally incompetent patients who want to kill themselves without doctor persuasion. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this defense, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of patients. It seems to me that euthanasia is a characteristic of a society that no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. 帰るか。うんうんうんえ遅い。One of the most important ways a caregiver must work for victims with a terminal illness is about life and death decisions that arise with the progression of disease. As the disease progresses, the patient will have less ability to discuss, reason, and express his wishes regarding the choice available when he is confronting the last stage of the disease. However, with Richards, does he want the extreme measures, such as altitude breathing and tube feeding? It is important for the family and the victim to think about this question long before the victim is completely without any voice. These issues are difficult to discuss under any circumstances, as discomfort with death is evident in our desire to control it. On the one hand, we have tried to wrestle with this by denying it as a dying patient is staying in an artificial state of life through advanced medical technology. Many people have recognized, however, that these attempts to keep death at a distance have been causing a lot of suffering for families involved. Preparing a living well with a patient while he is oh my god 聞き取れない No, preparing living well with a patient. 聞いてなかった。Having causing the real suffering for the family involved. Preparing a living well with a patient while he is in the early stages of the disease is one step towards addressing his objection to the use of extraordinary measures taken to sustain a living state artificially while he is dying. 逆に遅く感じるな。One of the most important ways a caregiver must work for a victim with a terminal illness is about life and death decisions that arise with the progression of disease. As the disease progresses, the patient will have less ability to discuss, reason, or express his wishes regarding the choice available when he is confronting the last stage of the disease. How will he want to be treated? Does he want extraordinary measures, such as artificial breathing and tube feeding? It is important for a family and the victim to think about these questions long before the victims conflict without any voice. These issues are difficult to discuss under any circumstances. Our discount with death is evident in our desire to control it. On the one hand, we have tried to wrestle with death by denying it as a dying patient is sustained in an artificial state of life through advanced medical technology. Many people have recognized, however, that these attempts to keep death at a distance have been causing a lot of suffering for the family involved. Preparing a living will with a patient while he is in early stage of the disease is one step to addressing his objection to the use of extraordinary measures taken to sustain a living state artificially while he is dying. One of the most important ways a caregiver must work for victims with a terminal illness is about life and death decisions that arise with the progression of the disease. As the disease progresses, the patient will have less ability to discuss, reasons and expressed his wishes regarding the choices available when he is confronting the last stages of the disease. How will he want to be treated? Does he want external measures, such as artificial breathing and to feeding? It is important for family and the victim to think about these questions long before the victim is completely without any voice. These issues are difficult to discuss under any circumstances. Our discomfort with the death is evident in our desire to control it. On the one hand, we have tried to wrestle with the death by delaying it as the dying patient is sustained in our shared life through advanced medical technology. Many people have recognized, however, that this attempt to keep death at a distance have been causing a lot of suffering for the family involved. Preparing a living well with the patient while he is in early stage of the disease is one step to addressing his objections to the use of extreme measures taken to sustain a living state artificially while he is dying. International talks jointly hosted by Japan and the World Health Organization opened Saturday in Tokyo to discuss how to contain a possible global pandemic sparked by the spread of bird among humans. The 2 days gathering of delegates from more than 30 nations, mainly in Asia, and international organizations comes at a time when concerns are mounting that the H5N1 strain of avian influenza, which has been spreading throughout Asia and has recently cropped up in Turkey, could change into a form that could pass easily among humans and potentially kill millions of people. The delegates are expected to discuss and recommend regional and international response mechanisms, such as an early warning detection system for a pandemic and operation support for early response efforts in Asia. Organizers say rapid containment will include the use of antivirals or pandemic and operation support for early response efforts in Asia. Organizers said rapid containment will include the use of antivirals to snuff out the spread of the virus. First, possible public health measures such as quarantine, restrictions on human movement, and social distancing. A WHO media advisor said the event is part of an international initiative aimed at increasing distancing human movements and social distancing. A WHO media advisor said the event is part of an international initiative aimed at increasing global collaborations and coordination before a pandemic strikes. A simulation by researchers on a new type of influenza showed Wednesday that such a disease will spread dramatically via crowd trains. According to a simulation, in a city with a population of 800,000, the number of flu patients would peak in about 50 days after the infection of the first person under usual circumstances. However, when crowd trains are factored in, the number of flu patients can peak 20 to 40 days earlier and increase victims overall by about 10 percentage points. International talks, jointly hosted by Japan and World Health Organization, opened Thursday in Tokyo to discuss how to contain a possible global pandemic sparked by the spread of bird flu among humans. The 2 days gathering of delegates from more than 30 nations, mainly in Asia, an international organization, comes at a time when concerns are mounting that the H5N1 strain of avian influenza, which has been spreading throughout Asia and has recently cropped up in Turkey, could change into form that could pass easily among humans and potentially kill millions of people. The delegates are expected to discuss and recommend regional and international response mechanisms, such as an early warning detection system for pandemic and operational support for early response efforts in Asia, organizers said. Rapid containment would include the use of antivirals to snuff the spread of the virus, plus possible public health measures such as quarantine, restriction on human movement, and social distancing. A WHO media advisory said the event is part of an international initiative aimed at increasing global cooperation. Uh, aimed at increasing global cooperation. The event is aimed at increasing global collaboration, such as quarantine, restrictions on human movement, and social distancing. A WHO media advisory said the event is part of an international initiative aimed at increasing global collaboration and coordination before pandemic strikes. A simulation by researchers on a new type of influenza showed Wednesday that such a disease would spread dramatically via English global collaboration and coordination before pandemic strikes. A simulation by researchers on a new type of influenza showed Wednesday that such a disease would spread dramatically via crowd train. According to a simulation, in a state with a population of 800,000, the number of flu patients will peak in about 50 days after the infection of the first person under usual circumstances. However, when crowded trains are factored in, the number of flu patients can peak 20 to 40 days earlier and increase the victims overall by about 10 percentage points.どうしよっかな。どうすっかな。もう少しやるか。However, there is a completely opposite approach to control death is measured. In the understanding for bacterial disease, after all, when continued life will only bring greater suffering, what's the point in living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the result indicates that the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, a Washington state law banning doctor-assisted suicide was struck down. The reason being that procuring assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves without doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been satisfied as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that euthanasia is a characteristic of society that no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. まあいいや。More recently, however, there has been a complete opposite つってんの opposite approach. Opposite. Opposite. オポサイトって発音してたわ。Opposite. Opposite. Opposite. Opposite, opposite, opposite approach. Mm. More recently, however, there has been a complete opposite approach to countering death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of fatal disease to think of bringing on his own death. After all, when continuing life will only bring greater suffering, what's the point of living? This logic has been tested recently in the federal court system, and the result indicates that the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, a Washington state law banning doctor-assisted suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminal illness, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such a law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be or just get just the prescription. The intention of such a law justified as of getting suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that euthanasia is a characteristic of a society that no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. More recently, however, there has been a completely opposite approach to countering death, euthanasia. It is understandable for a victim of fatal disease to think of bringing on death. After all, one continuing life will only bring little suffering. What's the point in living? This logic 集中力切れてきたか。Have been tested recently in the federal court system, and the results indicate that the right to die is rapidly becoming an issue that must be addressed directly by religious communities. For example, a Washington state law banning doctor-assisted suicide was struck down. The reason being that prohibiting assisted suicide violates the constitutional rights of terminally ill, mentally competent patients who want to kill themselves with a doctor's prescription. The intention of such law has been justified as a way of getting rid of suffering. Despite this difference, euthanasia is often understood to be an objectionable act intended to cause the death of a patient. It seems to me that euthanasia is characteristic of society, no longer has faith in the purpose and intention of God. まあいいか。